In the book, and in the movie version a couple of years later, Griffin, a white man, tells the story of how he darkened his skin with dye, medicine, and intense UV rays in order to experience what it was like for African Americans in the pre-civil rights South of the 1950s.
Well, what's the big idea?
I want to find out what it's like to be a Negro in the South.
You kidding?
Over the course of 6 weeks, Griffin recounts how he was harassed, followed, and threatened by racist whites.
You better find yourself another place to sit.
And in the end, he says that his assumption blacks were treated like second-class citizens turned out to be wrong. It was closer to 10th class.
You know what we do to troublemakers here?
No?
You kill a nigger and toss him one of these swamps, nobody ever know anything about it.
The book became a bestseller and a sensation, and it had a profound impact on me and countless other high schoolers. But when I revisited the book as an adult, something stood out that I hadn't thought about as a kid. Toward the very beginning of the book, Griffin asks, how else, except by becoming a Negro, could a white man hope to learn the truth, ultimately concluding that the best way to find out if we had second-class citizens and what their plight was would be to become one of them.
A white Southerner has to know what it's like to be a Negro. Really know.
And you know what it's like, huh? After 10 weeks or 3 months or whatever it is, you know.
No, I don't know. And I can never know.
Rereading this, I realized the entire premise was off. Griffin was attempting to understand racism by momentarily occupying blackness. He became a person of color. And while there's no question there's real value in whites trying to understand and ultimately empathize with the experience of African Americans, it struck me that we rarely, if ever, turn this line of thinking around. In other words, instead of asking what it's like to be black, what if we just asked what it's like to be white?
I don't really know what it means really to be white or what it's supposed to mean.
I guess I never really thought about it, but it was always kind of a negative thing.
When I ask students what it means to be white, what I hear from them is a lot of confusion.
The question, what does it mean to be white? It baffles my mind. I don't know what it means.
Whiteness isn't something we think much about, and in some ways, that makes perfect sense.
In terms of white culture, it's very general and very vague. Like I think sitting down and having dinner with my family. But all cultures do that.
Because when you're part of a dominant group, you're not forced to spend a lot of time thinking about how you fit in or about how your privileges as a member of the dominant group might affect others who don't belong to it.
In order to express ourselves, we don't have to fit into Black culture, Hispanic culture, Asian American culture. We can just kind of do what we want. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just...
This doesn't mean that all white people have it easy or that there aren't differences between the struggles of poor and working class white kids who have to work for everything and rich white kids who have things handed to them. Of course, those differences are real. But none of that changes the fact that throughout the history of this country, being white has been far easier than not being white.
Oh, God, I love being white. I really do. Seriously, if you're not white, you're missing out, because this is thoroughly good. But let me be clear, by the way. I'm not saying that white people are better. I'm saying that being white is clearly better. Who could even argue? If it was an option, I would re-up every year. Oh, yeah, I'll take white again. Absolutely. I've been enjoying that. I'm going to stick with white. Thank you.
And let's face it, there's no denying that white people in the U.S. have had privileges throughout history that people of color simply haven't. Consider the very first law passed by Congress after ratifying the Constitution, the Naturalization Act of 1790, which said that free white persons and only free white persons could become full citizens of this country. Basically, our very first law as a constitutional republic gave white immigrants privileges that black people and immigrants of color and indigenous Native North Americans weren't given, all of it based purely on skin color. And whether we want to acknowledge it or not, this kind of systematic white privilege and race-based favoritism is built into the very foundations of the country.
In 1935, Franklin D. Roosevelt put his signature on the Social Security Act.
Look at all the social programs that pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression and helped create the middle class in this country. programs like job insurance, which provided cash to people to give them a leg up as they looked for work.
To show how job insurance works, let's introduce Steve, a Louisiana worker who has just lost his job. He goes first to the nearest state employment office to register for a new job. Steve needn't hesitate about going in, because this office was set up just to help people like him.
But while Steve in Louisiana could apply for job insurance, not everyone else could.
Of course, he cannot collect if he belongs to any of the groups of workers that the law does not insure. These are agricultural workers, domestic service in private homes.
Agricultural workers and domestic service workers didn't qualify for assistance, and it turns out this had everything to do with race. These two jobs were overwhelmingly held by black people, and over 80% of all blacks worked in those professions. So the only way FDR could get Southern Democrats to support the Social Security Act was if he agreed to exclude those workers from benefits. This was a conscious attempt by some in Congress to exclude as many blacks as possible, and the net effect of it was to give preferential treatment to whites.
Thousands of people get a big thrill out of looking at model houses, and a much bigger thrill when they buy one.
It was the same story with crucial housing assistance for the American middle class. Loans provided by the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, allowed working-class families for really the first time in American history to own their own homes.
Home ownership is the basis of a happy, contented family life. And now, through the use of a National Housing Act insured mortgage, is brought within the reach of all citizens.
But the way the bill was written, the American dream of home ownership wasn't within the reach of everyone. For the first 30 years of the program, about 98% of the recipients were white. People of color were almost completely barred. Then there was the GI Bill, which provided immense benefits to returning veterans, including low-cost mortgages, loans to start a business, cash payments for tuition, and living expenses. What the GI Bill didn't do is protect black veterans, who qualified for that assistance also, from the kinds of legal discrimination rampant in pre-civil rights America. The result was that the vast majority of those who benefited from the GI Bill were white veterans. If a program like the GI Bill ended up disproportionately benefiting people of color, you know what we'd call that? We'd call it welfare. We'd call it a reward, a handout, a gravy train.
The GI Bill of Rights is not a reward, or a handout, or a gravy train.
But that's not the way it was described.
But rather an American way to make it easier for each man to take his place once again in the community and get some of those things for which he went to war.
And I'm not trying to say programs like these are bad. There's no question. They've been instrumental in creating and expanding opportunities for millions of people. The point is that we're being dishonest if we fail to explicitly acknowledge how they almost exclusively benefited white people.
Who is covered by the Social Security Act? People like these.
It needs to be understood that for hundreds of years, government assistance programs pumped literally hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of wealth into the hands of white families before people of color even got to the starting gate. This is what we're talking about when we talk about white privilege, the structural advantages built into our very system that have helped white people, often without us knowing it, while making things more difficult for people of color.
For me, being white means that I'm treated as the default in a lot of cases.
Some of those privileges would be material, better job opportunities, better housing access, better educational opportunities, but some of them are psychological. Just the realization that I'm not going to be racially profiled when I'm driving around town or when I'm shopping in the mall, and I'm not going to be followed by store security because they think I might shoplift.
Before I got to college and stuff, I don't know, I was more of like a punk and what have you, so there were times where I would be like shoplifting, and my race occurred to me then because I was like, man, I feel like if I was any other race or ethnicity, I would be being watched by like security. So I felt very, like nothing would happen, so I didn't really mind doing it because I didn't get caught ever.
I read a paper where somebody was listing an experience where it was a group of females talking about, you know, what it's like to be a woman. And there was a white woman talking to a black woman saying, you know, well, we have similar experiences because we're both women. And the black woman looks at her and says, no, we don't. And she goes, well, yeah, but we're both women. And the black woman says, no, because when you look in the mirror, you're a woman. When I look in the mirror, I'm a black woman. So it's that thing that you have to, it's that thing that you don't notice.
For myself, from the very beginning, I was seen as a bright and capable child, and I was tracked into the higher level classes. If I didn't do well, I never had to worry that it would be ascribed to my race, that someone might say, well, of course he didn't do really very well in the SAT because, you know, he is white. And this isn't just an anecdotal one-off story. The fact is there are 20 to 25 years of research, studies which have found that students of color all around the country are worried about confirming negative stereotypes in the classroom. Any fear that somehow they might live down to a negative group stigma directly affects their performance on tests. That's something that I, as a white student, didn't have to worry about. And so we live with the legacy of inequality that began so long ago, but also the legacy of obliviousness that allows those of us in the dominant group to rarely even think about these matters. And even with all the changes and the progress we have seen, that is something that hasn't changed.